Good morning. Isn't it a beautiful day to talk about metrics? I always kid, this is now going to be the fourth time I made this point, that it blows me away that we can fill a room for 2 days to talk about the scintillating topic of metrics.
Annually.
Yeah. And I mean it. I don't think that this space gets, or this part of what we do gets enough attention. And so it's actually encouraging to me that we can get this many people in the room and that we're going to have the kinds of conversations that we will over the next 2 days. So kudos to you guys for being here, and let's get started with what I hope will be a really scintillating conversation with someone who thinks a lot about metrics, writes books about them, and has helped to create an incredible discussion in the world about microfinance and its actual impacts and the best ways of thinking about microfinance. And more broadly, how development should be measured and how we as a community can do the kind of research which is necessary to make significant claims about the impact that we're having. So I am joined by David Roodman, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, CGD. He focuses on microfinance, debt relief, and aid effectiveness. His widely praised, I'm reading his bio, and often criticized book, Due Diligence,
I don't think that was in there.
confronts questions about the impacts of microfinance and how it should be supported. He's written some other books with cool titles, like A Guide for the Perplexed, which I'm fascinated to get. His other book, The Natural Wealth of Nations, Harnessing the Market for the Environment, came out in 1998. Foreign Affairs claimed it was required reading for legislators around the world. How many of them read it, David?
I think pretty much.
But suffice it to say, he's someone who has done a lot of thinking about this, and I suspect many of you follow his blog and his work. I first had a chance to meet him when he was doing a panel session about Due Diligence, his new book, for CGD. And I wanted to start, David, with just the very beginning, which is, if you look at the book, it's got an interesting title, Due Diligence, An Impertinent Inquiry into Microfinance. So due diligence, as we all know, is something that generally happens at the beginning of an investment, not the end. So I'm thinking, is this the beginning or the end? And then it's impertinent. So I was puzzled by the title, thought it was interesting, and wanted to start with that question. So why due diligence, and why are you being so impertinent?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I am thoroughly impressed. I would never have guessed that such a thing as an annual conference on metrics in this field would exist. So I congratulate you on that. It's really fantastic. And I'm happy to be part of this. I don't think of myself as someone who studies metrics per se, but in the broad question of what do we know about what works, what constitutes valid evidence, how do you weigh different kinds of evidence and come to overall understandings. So you asked about due diligence and impertinence, right? Well, as I was writing this book, the audience that I conceived of as being most important is people who were considering whether to invest in microfinance, whether it was my mother, who could go on Kiva, or the Gates Foundation. So in that from that point of view, it was for people who were at the beginning of their potential engagement with microfinance. Of course, it's much easier to do due diligence if a lot of investment has already been made, and therefore there's a lot of experience to survey and study. So in that sense, it is paradoxical, I suppose. As for impertinence, well, it's sort of, it was alliterative. Impertinent inquiry. Mm-hmm. When I started out doing this, which I'm sorry to say was quite a long time ago, it took a long time to finish this, maybe 4 years, the reputation of microfinance was much more exalted. And so to ask, well, what do we really know about what it works? And I should say it was seen as something whose impact had been proven with scientific studies. So the kinds of questions that I was asking, the style in which I was asking them was seen as more impertinent than it has after all the controversies that have beset microfinance in the last 3 years, and as well as the arrival of other quite fierce and prominent critics, compared to whom I'm not so impertinent.
Right, that's right. Yeah. You're darn out nice compared to some of us.
Yeah.
Well, so you went through this long process of kind of an open architecture for writing the book, and it came out officially this year. What are the top level findings that you'd want to share? I know there are probably one or two people that haven't actually read the book. So what are the key takeaways?
Well, it was an achievement to write the book, and I gather it's also an achievement to read it. So I'm sure there's more than a few who haven't read it. The heart of the book is my realization that maybe I should back up. I mean, you said it's actually, the tone is actually fairly nice, and I think there's something to that. And at the book launch that you were at, I started by talking about my personal history. I'm the child of a rather nasty divorce that occurred when I was about 10, and maybe I'm overestimating the impact that it had on me. But I think at least reinforced a tendency in myself to want to hear out all sides, to believe that everybody's got something to offer, some piece of the truth, and even if they're not as good at reading the impact studies as I am, they have experience in the field that I can learn from, and so on. And so I think the style of the book really is to try to look at different kinds of evidence, historical, qualitative, quantitative, and see what is of value in each of those perspectives. And what I felt I needed to do in order to organize the different perspectives that I needed to take seriously was I realized that there are at least three conceptions of success sort of in play in the grand global conversation about microfinance. And they correspond to conceptions of development. So there's development as escape from poverty. That's what we hear most about in microfinance. Development as freedom, which is associated with Amartya Sen, who won a Nobel Prize in economics. And development as industry building, or you might call it development as transformation, which is associated with the work of Joseph Schumpeter. He's the one who popularized the term creative destruction and talked about development as a process. And so I try to evaluate microfinance as well as I can through each of these lenses and then synthesize. And I find that in each case there's good news and bad news. There's reason to be worried about microcredit sometimes making people worse off. There are times when microcredit clearly seems to be empowering people, like women who for the first time are able to do business in a public setting in a rather sexist society. But there are also cases of women being trapped in debt. There are both positives and negatives in each of these perspectives. And where I come down is if you ask, what is microfinance's greatest strength? I think it's not in helping people escape from poverty, at least as far as microcredit goes, which is the most famous for. But it is in building dynamic, sustainable institutions and industries that can deliver inherently useful financial services to millions of people with relatively little subsidy. That's not to say it always achieves that, but that's where its greatest potential is. And so as a practical matter, I think the best way forward is to help microfinance play to its strengths. If your daughter shows a talent for painting, you don't force her to learn guitar instead. So that's kind of where I come down on microfinance, is that it is quite unusual within the world of philanthropy and foreign aid in its record in setting up sustainable businesses and industries that serve the poor.
I think you're being too nice. Let me quote. On current evidence, the best estimate of the average impact of microcredit on the poverty of clients is 0.
Right.
And then my favorite line was, while microcredit isn't that successful, at least it's not the financial equivalent of cigarettes. I didn't make these up. So for people who are critics of microfinance, wouldn't they read your book, or at least the executive summary of your book, and say, yeah, this really doesn't work?
They certainly have done that. Although then they get confused because sometimes I say good things like I just did, and then they think I'm being inconsistent. And maybe I'm a spy or something.
Are you a spy?
I've been accused of being a double agent. I've been accused of being a double agent for CGAC. Yeah, so I mean, the best studies, the ones that I believe, the randomized trials that you certainly have heard about, are mostly returning zeros for impact on household welfare of microcredit over 12 to 18 months. So the findings have been more positive for savings so far over similar time frames, which is quite promising. And it's conceivable that the benefits of microcredit will be more positive once it's followed for more than 18 months. I think that those findings limit the extent to which we should subsidize microfinance, whether through grants or with social investors' capital that demands lower returns. But I still think that if a donor sets up the likes of ASHA in Bangladesh or BRI in Indonesia, these are ongoing institutions that are providing several different services on a sustainable basis to poor people. And then if a donor can help set that up and then walk away, that is still something to be proud of. And it arguably represents development in its truest sense. And this gets to the third conception of development that I talked about, development as industry building. If you ask what has reduced poverty most in history, it's not meeting the MDGs, as it were, and the agenda that implies. It's not delivering health services or delivering education services or delivering clean water to the poor. It's this churning, disruptive process of industrialization, which is associated with political dimensions and cultural dimensions that is played out differently in each country, but that is what has reduced poverty most in the United States over the last 2 centuries, in China over the last few decades. And if you view that as development, then creating institutions that extend the financial system to a large new group of people sustainably, enriching the financial fabric, that is a modest achievement to what is arguably true development. But it's not lifting millions out of poverty, but against realistic expectations, it's not something to be dismissed.
Yeah, but if I may continue to be, cheeky, enriching the financial fabric. Who cares? What does that mean? Does that help people eat better? And to push harder, as we've had our previous discussions, to enrich that financial fabric, it's been a $15.7 billion subsidy. And so is that worth it? Have the studies been done to show that that's worth it?
Right. Well, enrich the financial fabric. Yes, I think it's worth it. It may not be what you're in this business to do, and that's your choice. But it is the essence of what has made us affluent. It's a small instance of the process that has made us live comfortable lives. It has brought new services to poor people on a large scale. It has empowered them in that sense. It has created jobs, created innovation that ripples through the economy. I guess that $15.7 billion, is that the current stock of capital that's been invested?
No, I think that's actually from your book, that was the amount of subsidy that you estimated that went into microfinance.
I'm not sure what that number is, but that may be a flow. So if you invest at sub-market returns, that's not 100% subsidy. But anyway, the point is billions have gone into subsidy. Right. No, I say in the book that I think there's probably too much money going into microcredit. Partly because we don't have convincing evidence that it is systematically lifting people out of poverty, and that should have implications for how much we pour into this, as opposed to other interventions. Partly because if you take seriously this idea that you're trying to build a sustainable industry that serves the poor, then too much money is a direct threat. It can create bubbles, which we've seen in the microcredit industry, which I don't really have to explain, and it can undermine the incentive to take savings as an alternative source of funds for on lending. If the investors based here in Washington or in Luxembourg are ready to write you $10 million checks and expect low, sub-market returns, that's a lot easier to take than to go into the savings business and open lots of tiny savings accounts that may lose money for years before they get big enough. And it also undermines the incentive to lobby for the right to take savings as a matter of political economy.
So let me go back just a bit. And let's say I was a big fan of microfinance, and I actually have been. A lot of the work that has shown positive impacts has been anecdotal and qualitative. And some of the pushback against the book has been, RCTs aren't everything. There's a big role for qualitative data. Are there enough anecdotes that we could ever add up so that you would feel differently? And if not, what can microfinance do now to improve the type of research and the type of analysis that's being done about its impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. couple responses. First of all, as I think I've indicated, I am interested in different kinds of evidence. There is a chapter that is dominated by RCTs, is bottom line. But then there's another chapter that's much more shaped by looking at qualitative evidence. Not so much the stories that you might hear from practitioners or the Micro and Microfinance websites, but the reports back from trained anthropologists who spend a month or a year in a place where people are using microfinance. So I do take that seriously, that kind of evidence seriously. And I should say, it's very hard to generalize from, though. Even when it's done by trained anthropologists, it's still extraordinarily fragmentary. It might be 50 people in one village in Bangladesh. And so there's always this question about how you generalize from it, and is it representative? Forced to generalize, when reading that stuff, I suggest that the most famous form of microfinance, which is group microcredit, is most worrying. There are enough stories in these studies of people being trapped in debt, women who couldn't pay back a loan, and so their peers were responsible for that loan and didn't want to pay, so they came and took her roof away to sell it, to repay the loan. There are enough stories like that I couldn't say, well, this is 1 in a million, it's not something we should just ignore. It might have been 1 in 10 or 1 in 20. It was hard to tell. But the question still stands, how do you generalize from stories? What is the truth? And I can't completely answer that. The issue came up a couple of years ago when the microfinance groups here in Washington and I guess New York issued a joint response to the arrival of the first randomized trials. And it began, I think there were 6 signatories, Grameen Foundation, Action International, and so on. And there was a 3-sentence anecdote from each signatory, Maria in Nicaragua took a loan and did this, blah, 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 blah. For other reasons, I took issue with the statement. And one of the points I made is, you get stories from all over, and they're not, you can't assume that they're representative. People are going to tell you the stories. It's my job, if I tell you about where I work, the Center for Global Development, to tell you the best stories I can about how we've had an impact and why you should support us. And it's probably your job to do the same thing, to find the best stories. And beyond that, sometimes you see something or you hear something that really has an impact on you, and it sticks with you, and it shapes how you see things. We understand, as human beings, we understand the world through stories. But if the stories that are coming at your eyeballs and your ears are non-representative, what do you do with them? What you might want to do is start systematically collecting them. Taking a random sample of people. And maybe you want to make the sample large so that it's not thrown by 1 or 2 extreme cases. And as the sample gets larger, you're going to have to start codifying and organizing these stories, like did they go up or down, did they invest, did they consume? And pretty soon you're doing real research. And so in a sense what research is about is systematically collecting stories. It is a response to the problem, and it's so I respect stories, but at the end of the day, it's hard. I feel like I have to discount most of them. I think storytelling is really important for people who want to communicate what they're doing. It's just a question of whether you tell stories that you believe are representative of the truth.
There's a quote in one of your blogs, and I think it's one that you use a lot, where you say that research is the pursuit of responsible generalization.
Yeah.
Which maybe summarizes a little bit of what
Right.
you were just saying.
Yeah.
But how do you know when you can responsibly generalize? So how many, even if it's RCTs or more academically focused studies, how many is enough? And in the case of microfinance, God, you would have thought they would have had plenty, but they don't.
Yeah, good question. The answer depends in part on what you're trying to do. If you are a seeker of the truth, then, well...
Amen.
Then I suppose you need a lot of studies. If you have to decide tomorrow whether to put $10 million into a project, you just have to go with what you got, and more is usually better. The situation with microfinance now is that we are seeing more and more studies. I think there are now, 5 or so randomized trials of microcredit, all looking 12 to 18 months pretty much. And this is what you want to have happen. They're in diverse locales, diverse types of microcredit, individual, group, Most are of for-profits, but one is of a non-profit. You know, we've got rural Morocco, rural Mongolia, urban India. And as it happens, by and large, they're telling about the same story, which is there does seem to be a stimulus to microenterprise, higher profits, higher investment, but at least in that time frame, it is not translating into household gains, whether it be income or spending or nutrition. When you start to get that kind of situation where you're getting similar results from a diverse set of circumstances, then it becomes more reasonable to generalize to the extent that one must in one's day-to-day work.
Yeah, but so it's not 12 studies?
More is better.
What, you know, I do want to push a little bit on that because when can you stop? When can you say?
True. It's a good question because the studies cost money, so that's a pragmatic decision about when it's worth investing more.
Yeah.
It's a good question. Although at the end of the day, the cost of these studies is small relative to the amount of money that's going into microfinance. So, you know, even if it, you know, if a $200,000 study helps make microfinance as a whole 1% more cost effective, you know, or more effective, than it probably has paid for itself. So you can probably justify a lot of studies because they're cheap relative to the total amount of money that's going into this field.
Well, if you were worrying about microfinance, maybe, but not so much, say, the small and growing business sector, which has a little less money going into it.
That's right.
Until we can succeed fully in our job.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to that in a second, and just a sort of 5-minute warning, I'm going to go to the audience for questions in a bit. Again, related to this topic, though, you talk about the dangers of getting ahead of academic evidence. And I think you said that in the context of microfinance. So can you explain, you know, what they did wrong in terms of their research agenda, and then perhaps more importantly for us, what can we learn from that so that we do it right as we think about the research that we need to fund and to implement in the small and growing business space?
Well, in defense of the microfinance movement, there really were fancy studies that appear in the 1990s which seem to say impact on poverty is proven. So, so perhaps I've even been a little bit unfair in warning about getting ahead of the evidence because these were studied in these were published in prestigious journals, and the microfinance movement, people like Muhammad Yunus, had every right to cite them as showing that they were on the right path. So the reason there's been this reversal is that the field of economics has correctly, I think, come to understand that those studies were not really reliable. That it's one thing to find correlations, but it's much harder to interpret them as causation from A to B rather than B to A. And that the randomized approach really does cut that Gordian knot. And that is just, as for reasons I don't fully understand, that movement has just built up over the last 10 years. That said,
so just to be clear, those initial academic studies were not randomized controlled trials?
They were not.
Okay.
Yeah. They would survey 1,800 households in Bangladesh and look for patterns and then use some very fancy math to try to figure out what was causing what. Okay. And that fancy math got them into prestigious journals, but it didn't more often obscured the problem, the underlying problems of determining causality than solving them. So I've just given a defense of microfinance, but you know, the fact remains that rather extraordinary claims were made that I think at the end of the day don't fit common sense. Small loans to poor people are not going to end poverty. It just never happened in human history. And so why did they do that? Well, it worked. It's kind of what I said before. We're all in the business of promoting what we believe in. And there's this long chain, you know, from the promoters in the field, the practitioners in the field, to the people at headquarters at a microfinance institution, to the funders, you know, back to the politicians and the taxpayers who are providing foreign aid. And at each step along the way, people tell stories to the next one person in the chain, and they tell what works. And so there's this discovery process. So ultimately, the people who wrote the checks, whether it be small donors or large, were creating an evolutionary environment that rewarded certain kinds of storytelling or descriptions of what was going on, and penalized others. And so people figured that out. So we're all somewhat culpable in this dynamic. It's unfortunately quite universal in philanthropy. And the problem is that leads to fads because it's not grounded in reality, and then reality bites, and then people swing to other things. And we do want to try to minimize that because in order to use the philanthropy more effectively and efficiently and help people who are very much deserving. How to do that? Well, I don't want to counsel paralysis by analysis, right? Doing 10 studies before you actually, you know, break ground, right?
We're good. We've broken ground.
So I think, and I actually
look at ground.
Yeah. I think the ideal involves a process in which you learn as you go, and I think I can probably learn from you about how to do that. There are different kinds of learning. There are randomized trials. There are pilot projects where you're testing new interventions. I think there's a spectrum of, from low cost, quick turnaround to high cost, more rigorous. And you want to be working along that whole spectrum and design learning into what you do.
So yeah, just to repeat, because this really is one of the core questions that we're facing and we'll be discussing in our research initiative when we launch it in about 45 minutes, is this idea of having a wide variety of studies. Right. Obviously, I think you would say they have to include some RCTs, right? Otherwise,
probably
it's not going to work. Are there things that you would, besides RCTs, are there types of research or efforts that you would emphasize in addition to that?
Sure. I draw on all sorts of evidence in the book. I think the financial diaries and portfolios, as exemplified by Portfolios of the Poor, have been fantastic. That's a mixture of really micro data and collecting stories. And you can do that, or maybe you just collect stories, but from a randomized sample. I just blogged a study yesterday that was essentially an RCT. But at the end, they had 2 case studies, very brief, which I found just wonderfully enriching. So you can blend these things. I think story collection is great. You just want to do it in a way that's as representative as possible. I think the tough questions that I've been asking about impact need to be particularly tough when we're looking at microcredit, because credit can do harm, right? We know that it can make people worse off. If you're piloting other interventions where there's a very obvious potential downside, I think the threshold has to be higher. If you're looking at micro savings, it's less, or something like that, where it's pretty hard to see how it could do harm. Then indicators like market take-up become more useful. Just looking at whether people want it.
Do you see a distinction between microcredit to micro entrepreneurs and small credit to small and growing businesses? Or is there still the same potential harm there?
I mean, I don't know. I assume that small and growing businesses are not as small.
Right. So they're looking,
micro.
Let's say it's a baseline of $20,000 loan.
Yeah. Presumably, as you move up, you're dealing with people who are going to manage credit more wisely and are not going to just take a loan because it's easy and buy makeup, So, yeah, I would say that those concerns do attenuate.
Like, can they go to zero so we don't have to worry about this whole thing? Because we could all just go party. I take it not. But, okay, let me flip it to you, because we can't quite party yet. We're just starting the day. When you have, I'll call on you when you have a question. Please say your name and where you're from. Shubha?
Shubha. I'm from the Media Development Fund. So, yes, okay. So this was really great. And one thing is, at the very beginning, I really liked the defining the different groups of success for development. And there are things that I'm sure we've all thought, but I hadn't articulated it in that way. Our organization very specifically is definitely not in the end poverty camp. We're in the development as freedom camp, and we're quite clear of that. But I was wondering if you could elaborate on the industry building in the microcredit, because I actually think that probably applies to a lot of us too, and I didn't quite follow how you end up with all these households that are perhaps even worse off and in poverty, and somehow that's industry building. So if you could just explain that a little bit more.
Right. Well, as I say in the chapter that discusses this perspective, there's room for critique. Clearly, there have been instances in the last few years where we've had growth that is, if anything, the opposite of development. We've had overshoots, credit being too easy, people getting in trouble with it. So that's something that we don't want, and that's part of why I say if you want to help microcredit in particular, play to its strengths, if anything, we need to be pouring less money into it to try to minimize these dynamics. So I guess I'm trying to distinguish between, the question of does microfinance work? What are its average impacts out there in the world? And what is the best way forward? Because those can be different. There are other cases where the credit market seems to be pretty stable, and so they embody the potential. Things in Bangladesh, despite my concerns of have seemed to be pretty stable. Things have been stable in Bolivia and Peru and Indonesia. So there are examples of microcredit not overshooting, and presumably providing a service that is usually useful to people. Even in the cases where there have been bubbles, I see that the major damage is being to the industry rather than to the clients. Not to say that the clients are not hurt, but most of the time, the investors are taking pretty big losses. They are getting slammed. And so it's just like this is failure from the Trumpetarian perspective to build a sustainable industry. Does that help? Is it?
Sort of. I'm just interested in the strength through industry building and
Sure.
how.
Yeah.
Does that maybe that
Yeah, you make a pretty compelling case about the fact that a lot more people have access to financial services than they did before, and that in and of itself is a good, because giving access to financial services for the poor is useful. So maybe elaborate on that a little bit. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I talk about financial services as being inherently but not automatically useful. Amartya Sen, when he talks about development as freedom, he says, living a good life, as it were, means you have agency in many domains. You have an agency, different forms of agency support each other. So if you're better educated, that will lead to more income. More income will lead to better education. And financial services are about helping people manage their money, right? That's they serve people by helping them manage money. And money is at the core of a lot of what we do. So inherently, they're about giving you more control over your circumstances, which is freedom, which, as Amartya Sen defines it, is development. They don't always do that. You can get in trouble. But I don't think that the fact that you can get in trouble with financial services is a strong argument that we shouldn't provide them at all, right? Any more than it is for me. So I think the overall thrust of a movement that is trying to bring safe financial services to poor people is correct, and we need to make sure that it's doing so as best it can.
So Amisha.
It's on the same line, actually. Hi, I'm Amisha from Endeavour. We work with high growth entrepreneurs, so although we're working with small and growing businesses, we're probably on the higher growth end of that. And we're definitely into transformational entrepreneurship. I think something we find difficult, especially with international donors, is that they want to hear stories about how we're combating poverty, not how we're building industries. And I'm wondering, did you see that in microfinance? How are people dealing with that? Like you said, microfinance actually seems to be building industries, but that's not a very sexy story to tell to funders. So how do you suggest we deal with that?
It's a real problem, as I think I pretty much said. I've seen this in particular at Action International, which has pretty much had that philosophy as well. They're in Microfinance Network Group. But there was a period, especially after the controversial IPO of Comportamos, I guess it was 2007, where they were kind of on the defensive, and they went very hard for this message about how they were lending to end poverty. And it created I think it created a lot of cognitive dissonance within the organization. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for it, except to, it's a long run challenge of trying to educate donors. I appreciate the work of GiveWell, that I think is trying to offer an alternative, almost alternative cognitive model of philanthropy about how you think about what you do. If they're successful in building a counter movement, I think that will help you in the long run. It's a tough one.
Yes, sir.
Tom Brunner from Big Frog Investments. Question I have is, I see microlending as, in a sense, a subset of a broader range of financial inclusion services. And you began to develop the idea that, for example, with micro savings, there's more of an inherent good in the nature of the product. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how you could extrapolate the conclusions you've drawn about metrics to perhaps offer some framework for metrics in other types of microfinance beyond microlending.
First, I had one more thought for the question over here, Amisha. Send them my book. The people within DFID were facing the same problem with designing their financial services program, and I went and gave a talk there, and that's the UK aid agency, in February. And they loved my talk, and I don't think it was because it was a brilliant presentation. I think it was because I gave them more of a storyline for exactly what they needed to say internally to make the case to get their projects funded. So, but to your question, you know, it's hard for me to generalize. As I said, the burden of evidence, I think, has to be higher for microcredit, especially to very poor people. Is the point you brought out. As you move up the scale, I think there's less of a concern that it's going to be used in the wrong ways. There's less of a concern that it's going to do harm, and so then the market test is more meaningful. The big lesson, what I've already said, is that I think you do need to look at multiple conceptions of success and query the kinds of evidence that they lead you to, and then synthesize that. That doesn't mean that all religions are true. At the end of the day, you may decide that one perspective dominates, but I found that that was what I had to do in order to ground myself. I do believe strongly that the randomized studies are superior to the non-randomized ones. The non-randomized ones are not really that reliable, but I still take seriously the qualitative evidence, which I distinguish from those. That's about all I can offer, I guess.
Back, is that Katie?
This may build a little bit off of Tom's question, but I'd be interested to hear your comments on
A theme, which is I like the specificity that you bring to speaking about microcredit and micro savings, and thinking about how we turn some of this research into sort of almost like proactive market research. That maybe this isn't about bringing one product to a massive swath of people, but thinking about how microcredit really does positively serve a smaller branch of people, and we can be responsible by identifying the people for whom it will be the most useful. And so thinking perhaps again about why we talk about SGBs and not SMEs, what would be your thoughts on how we can read some of the research that's out there in microfinance to think about how we identify the right populations to be serving with certain types of interventions and sort of creating market research for our organizations?
It's an interesting question. I think at the low end, which is where I've been thinking and working, microcredit and micro savings, for the most part you can't do that because the challenge at the very bottom end is to limit transaction costs, because you can easily spend more than $100 making a $100 loan if you're not careful. And so the thrust, as a matter of sort of business survival, has been towards mass production of fairly uniform, low-quality services. But that's what's viable for poor people. Technology may be changing that because it can automate customization. Now you're moving a step up, I think, where you can't. There may be more scope for customization, for targeting different niches. To the extent, I guess that's what they teach you in business school about marketing, right? Understanding your customer and the segments, the client segments, and so on. What it does remind me of is a session I was just at yesterday about the new World Bank-run FINDEX, Financial Inclusion Index thing, where they have extraordinarily detailed data from, from I don't know what it was, 150 countries or whatever. And the headline numbers are about how many people have a bank account. But there's a lot of detail in there about how people use their accounts, because sometimes they have one and they hardly use it, or why they don't use it, and I think even what they use it for. And this Beth Ryan at Axion was in the session pointing this out, that she'd been looking into this. And I think there's a lot of insight from that, just basics understanding how they're using the services and whether they're using the services, that can then lead you to adapt new products.
Yeah, Taylor?
I'm Taylor from Acumen.
Hold on just a second.
Sure. Thanks. David, you talk about the spectrum from kind of low cost, quick turnaround types of evaluations to higher cost, longer timeline, more involved RCT types of evaluations. In thinking about that spectrum and maybe using microfinance as an example, how do we think about designing different types of interventions for different situations? If looking at a portfolio and trying to draw a map of how we can go really deep into certain questions and maybe try to answer other questions more quickly and more of a light touch method, what are some frameworks we can use to think about really how to get the best answers in the best scenarios?
It's a great question. It's not one that I've thought about a lot, so I'm not sure I have a lot to offer. Someone who has, I think, thought a lot about this is Chris Dunford, who is just stepping down as the head of Freedom from Hunger. And among the major microfinance network groups in the United States, I think he's the only one he's the only head of such a group that had a PhD. So he's always had more of a researcher's penchant. And so he's hearing from funders who want RCTs and struggling with the problems of how much those cost, how long they take, how can we do those because they are valuable, he appreciates that, but also do what you're talking about, learning in a more rapid way. And I feel like this is an area where I need to learn a lot. But I think as you get to more rapid turnaround kinds of research and experimentation, that you are, I think, getting into the traditional realm of business administration, right? This is what successful businesses do. So I would think that there is established thinking for a lot of this.
Let's go back to the back.
I'm Paula with the IDB, and I have a question related to all those randomized trials are focusing on how the impact on poverty reduction, but what about other aspects like, improving people's life, allowing those parents to keep their kids in school because they can pay the school fees, they can pay medical bills. All this is consumption smoothing that we in the first world are using credit for at the end of the day. I mean, I'm using the credit to buy a house because I can get a better house, I can pay the school bills, I can pay all these things. What is the research telling us about all these type of life improvements that are not just basic poverty reduction?
It's telling us pretty much what I said. The researchers are not just looking at impacts on household spending, which is the usual metric, $2 a day, $3 a day. They're also looking at whether kids had to go see a doctor, whether they're in school. They try to get in limited ways at whether consumption is more volatile or more smooth. I think one of the questions that Dean Carlin liked to ask is, did you go to bed hungry any time in the last month? So I think it's a good question that gets to what you're talking about. When you use credit to buy a house or buy a boat, that's not consumption smoothing. What credit is really doing when we talk about consumption smoothing is it's assuring that we can always get the necessities while also getting other things like a boat or a house. And so he's getting at whether people can access necessities all the time. And generally, with the major caveat that this is 12 to 18 months, they're not seeing impacts on these things for credit.
But keeping kids in school might, give a better chance.
It might. They're not seeing an impact on that. It's possible that if they follow this out for 5 years, if they manage to do that, that they'll see longer-term impacts of the kind you're talking about.
By the way, I sense and feel your pain. I've been saying this line about how microfinance lifts millions of families out of poverty for years now, and he means that I can't say it anymore.
No,
It's crushing me.
there are other aspects that, we use credit for certain things. It is not just helping us, like we live every day, but like allows us to reach for other things. And those aspects, I think, are very relevant. And smoothing consumption or just allowing to get either expenses can be very relevant.
I think we agree. Allison, up here in front. I'm trying to give Stella a workout.
I'm Allison. I'm coming from. Is it on? Nice. I'm coming from Grassroots Business Fund. I'm wondering your thoughts on the role of best practices, both within microfinance and within impact investing, which is a broader set of industries. So within microfinance, the SMART campaign. So how do we, I don't know that intimately, but it's kind of policies and practices to make sure that people aren't getting over indebted, and helping to mitigate potential negative effects and enhance the positive potential impacts. And in impact investing, that may be making sure the businesses we invest in have solid labor practices, operational health and safety, provide training to their low-income suppliers, this sort of thing, some of the aspects that GEARS measures. And I'm wondering if any of the studies within microfinance have tried to compare organizations that really have strong policies and practices versus those who don't, and what that those sorts of practices how they should play a role in our research agenda.
Right. Well, in the second part, your second question, from my point of view, starts to answer the first in the following way. So there are a set of ideas out there that I mean, I think the SMART campaign can do no harm. Well, maybe it could, but the basic thrust seems positive. The idea of creating a set of norms and getting investors and microfinance institutions to sign on to those norms. They have to do with disclosure and collection practices and so on. But I do also have a cynical reaction, which is, it's very easy to pay lip service to these things. For a savvy microfinance institution raising money from investors will, of course, sign on to this. Does that affect what they actually do? Which then comes to the empirical question, right? What do we know? Do we really have any evidence that this affects practice, that this helps poor people? Which is kind of where you were going with your question. Has this been studied? It has not, as far as I know. And so I'd like to see that kind of evidence, and until I see that, I think I'm going to be a bit skeptical of how much difference it's making. Maybe if I were more involved day to day in the industry, I would be able to see for myself that it is. But it's easy. You can be incredibly well-intentioned, incredibly careful, and still have a credit bubble. So I think the industry dynamics, at the end of the day, trump. And whether people can use credit usefully and in a good way, constructively. That trumps. There's also a set of ideas that make me nervous that are in this sort of area, which is that if we check a bunch of boxes, but how a microfinance institution operates, then we can be more confident they're lifting people out of poverty. And we just don't know that.
We'll do a couple more questions. Heather?
Thanks. Heather Esper from the William Davidson Institute. So last year we had Professor Al-Noor from Harvard come, and he talked about how we could use outputs and then extrapolate from there using data from other outcome studies and apply that information to extrapolate what our impact is on different SGBs. I kind of want to hear what you think of that kind of methodology as well as SRIs, where there's some assumptions that take place in coming to what an outcome is.
I see. Well, I don't understand exactly, but it sounds like it's a disciplined way to generalize from the limited evidence that we have, which is entirely appropriate because you do have to make concrete decisions tomorrow based on what you know. So that sounds reasonable as far as I understand it.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Christian.
Christian Spano, Anglo-American. I was thinking what we do when we try to think about microcredit schemes or microcredit loans. And we spend a lot of time trying to think about what's the starting point. Although our target is to improve the local condition of communities, it's always a question of where should we start? Should we start giving money directly to the poorest of the poor, or is that going to worsen the situation? And if not, where should we start? Should we go up and then start to impact poverty from the up down? So is the starting point that relevant, or are we losing time?
It's interesting. I never thought about that. I've mentioned once or twice that business realities shape how microcredit's actually done, micro savings too. It's a very tough evolutionary environment in which to survive. Serving the poor without losing your shirt. And those realities have generally meant that the poorest of the poor are not served by microfinance. Just, they would want if your smallest loan is $100 that you can do viably, they'll want a $25 loan, what have you. It's just not going to work. So there are certain limits, I guess, which can be pushed back through subsidy that are going to limit how far down market you can go. And so I think what would happen is a business chooses a starting point for whatever combination of accident and mission and training, and it develops a comparative advantage, or what was the term that Prahalad used, a core competency in that area. And that may distinguish it. If you go down market, you may be you may be staking out an area that the conventional banks are not reaching, and you master it, and that gives you a core competency and a strength from which you can then explore. And perhaps where you start is somewhat an accident. But.
So let me ask a final question then. You got an audience here of 100 people who are drawn together by at least two things. One, they fundamentally believe in the power of small and growing businesses to have some positive impact on the poor in emerging markets. And they're all the people who are going to be responsible for actually measuring that within their organizations. So what final bits of advice would you have to ANDE as an organization that's trying to help build this movement, and to the individuals who are actually going to be doing the work?
Mm-hmm. I think I would just sort of elaborate on something I said earlier, which is you want to be rigorous in your analysis and your pursuit of evidence, but also rigorous in thinking through the theories that you need to link the evidence, which will always be fragmentary, with the outcomes you care about. That's kind of what I tried to do in the book. So if you try to lay out your theory of change, how what you do is going to make the world a better place, and then see how that translates into a set of empirical questions, because probably there's a chain, and use that to guide how you go about seeing what evidence has already been collected, and how you might commission research to try to fill in blanks.
And will you promise to write a book about how great the sector is when we're done? Or at least a fair and balanced book? Now, let me ask you all to join me in thanking David for a really stimulating panel.
Good question.
Thank you.